Good morning and welcome to the 2022 Smithsonian Digitization Conference. I am Deron Burba, the Chief Information Officer for the Smithsonian. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for their support in making this year's Digitization Conference possible. Our sponsors this year include Meta, Amazon Web Services, Crowley, Digital Transitions, Bright Machines, Direct Dimensions, and Pictura. The Smithsonian Digitization Conference is a biennial event that began in 2006. It explores topics foundational to digital transformation in the cultural heritage community. It brings together Smithsonian staff and professionals from around the world to inspire, guide, and share ideas on how cultural heritage institutions can use digital and platforms to serve the public good. This conference started out as an in-house event, giving the Smithsonian staff an opportunity to learn about ongoing and upcoming digitization projects across the institution. In 2017, it was open to the wider cultural heritage community to incorporate broader views and insights and to showcase Smithsonian's work to this community. The audiences for past conferences have included colleagues from other cultural heritage institutions, government, universities, K-12 education, technology companies, and foundations. When held on site, participants came from as far as Japan and as near as other museums on the National Mall. Registrants numbered approximately 350 individuals. Because this year's event is virtual, the audience reach will be larger and more global. Now for some updates on our work. Our project with the National Museum of Natural History to digitize the herbarium continues, and we are a little over 98% complete. The red arrow is pointing to March of 2020, and we did lose a few months of capture during the pandemic. But we have continued to make good progress and look forward to completing this project this year. One exciting mass digitization project that we are working on is a collaboration to digitize, preserve, and make available online the Johnson Publishing Company archive. This project is jointly administered by the Getty and the Smithsonian on behalf of the co-owners, which include the Getty, Smithsonian, and the Ford, Mellon, and MacArthur Foundations. This will be a multi-year effort, and we look forward to sharing this with you as we work to bring this archive online for the public. With the limits on being able to start new digitization projects over the past years, we have shifted resources from object imaging to creating and improving digital records for objects. This slide includes some examples of items we digitized that require transcribing. As part of this shift, we have expanded our mass digitization processes and workflows in two important ways. First is to create a transcription protocol document that outlines how unstructured data from analog records are to be transcribed into structured data. These protocols go into exquisite, sometimes excruciating detail. On the left is the protocol document for a pilot project we are undertaking to create digital records from location registers documenting the paleobiology collections at the National Museum of Natural History. On the right, a few of the many examples that are in the protocol that illustrate the proper way to transcribe information in these registers into structured data. The transcription protocols are guidelines for human transcribers. But we're also exploring ways we might automate this process using machine learning tools available through cloud services. These services offer various out-of-the-box machine learning tools like ML/OCR. They are mature and don't require much training to use. They can also handle large data sets at low cost. Some recognize handwriting as well as more conventional types of text. What you see on the top of the slide is an example of an image of metadata tags associated with bee specimens in our natural history's entomology collections. The data highlighted in green were correctly recognized by the ML/OCR with a high degree of confidence. Data bounded by red were interpreted with a low degree of confidence. The idea here is to let ML/OCR interpret what it can and have human transcribers do what it can't. This would not only increase our throughput, but also saves us time and money. Professional transcription services in the US charge about 10 cents per field. In this test, as shown at the bottom of the image, OCR correctly interpreted 90% of the 30,000 scientific names on the tags, 60% of the locality names, and 70% of the collector names, and only 40% of the notes. If we had professional transcription service transcribe all of these, it would have cost us almost $11,000. But by automating part of this process via ML/OCR, and sending only the portion that needs human interpretation to a transcription service, our costs go down to $3,600. So these are the kinds of experiments that are helping us develop a blueprint for planning transcription projects in a scalable, more automated fashion. However, we do continue to rely on our digital volunteers, and thanks to the incredible work and dedication of digital volunteers, Smithsonian's collection staff from 21 different units and 63,000 curious learners worldwide, the Transcription Center has officially transcribed 1 million pages of Smithsonian collections. This incredible milestone means that our museum materials are more searchable and accessible than ever before. We will be hosting a live virtual event on April 12th with Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie G. Bunch, where he will be sharing the wide-ranging significance of 1 million pages transcribed. More information on the April event will be coming soon. On the 3D front, we have been continuing the development of our Voyager viewer and other components of our 3D pipeline. Recent enhancements have allowed us to enable augmented reality for all of our 3D objects. We've also collaborated with several partners using our content on their AR platforms. Internally, we've been working with the Smithsonian Latino Center on the Molina Family Gallery that will open later this spring. This new gallery serves as a preview of the National Museum of the American Latino. We are also working with the American Women's History Initiative, which has been amplifying the stories of American women and will continue this work while the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum is established. And finally, for some updates on the availability of 3D tools, we have recently added functionality to Voyager and its authoring tool, including a standalone story that allows scenes to be authored outside our usual Voyager ecosystem. I hope many of you were able to participate in yesterday's 3D workshop, to learn about Voyager and get some experience using the platform. Cook is a more robust and was used to AR enable all of our 3D assets we have captured. PackRat, our 3D repository, has reached minimum viable product stage, and we plan to release it on GitHub later this spring. All our open access models and collections data and images are available through our open API. With that, I will turn the program over to Diane Zorich, the director of the Smithsonian's Digitization Program Office. Thank you, and have a great conference, everyone.
Good morning. I'm Diane Zorich, director of the Smithsonian's Digitization Program Office. Welcome to our 7th Digitization Conference. The Smithsonian is located in Washington, D.C., which is the home of the Anacostan and Piscataway people who've lived here for centuries. These groups still thrive in this area, and we hope you'll learn more about them by visiting their respective websites, whose links we'll put in the chat. I encourage you to explore these sites, as well as information on tribes that are indigenous to areas where you're located, to learn about those who've lived here long before us, and to see how we might bring attention to and support their rich heritage and living traditions. I'd like to thank Deron Burba, the Smithsonian's Chief Information Officer, for his welcome address and for highlighting so many of the innovative digitization projects underway here at the Smithsonian. Thanks too to all of you for joining us in this, our first ever virtual conference. Before we begin the keynote and the day's panels, I'd like to pass along some general information. The conference sessions and demos are organized on 2 concurrent tracks, except for the welcomes and the keynotes, which will always be on track 1. Both today and tomorrow, we'll have a morning break from 11:15 to 11:30 and a lunch break from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m., and these are both Eastern Standard Time. Please remember to put your questions in the Q&A and use the chat for posting comments and relevant resources. We have Q&A monitors in the back end collecting your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. If you don't see the Q&A screen, please scroll down. It's underneath the video feed. This entire conference is being recorded, so if you're worried about missing something, you'll have a chance to view it later. And should you wish to participate in back-channel conversations on social media, the conference hashtag is SIDIGI2022. Please use the uppercase S, I, and D so that the hashtag will be read correctly by screen readers. And finally, if you have any questions or comments about the conference as it's ongoing or afterwards, please contact us via email, sidigi2022@si.edu. Our conference theme this year is Reach, Reassess, and Reimagine. We've just celebrated the 175th anniversary of the Smithsonian, and among the many celebrations was also a sense that we're at a turning point, since the pandemic has tested us all individually and as a society. Our interactions and outreach over the last 2 years have been solely mediated through digital technologies, and we've continued to learn and assess how best to use them to create effective change. But moving forward, it's going to be important for all of us to explore the role digital experiences will have in how our institutions can extend our reach, how we can reassess our impact, and how we can reimagine our role in a world that emerges from the pandemic. We hope the sessions and the keynotes from the conference start discussions on new and better ways to move forward. This conference is organized by a Smithsonian office that I have the honor of leading, the Digitization Program Office, also known as DPO. DPO works with museums across the Smithsonian and with technology partners, educators, and researchers to digitize our collections. Our mandate is to increase the quality, the quantity, and the impact of Smithsonian digitized holdings. We do so through three main programs. Our Policy and Analysis program compiles and analyzes digitization statistics across the institution. Then our Collections Digitization program uses this information to identify and digitize more collections using workflows and processes that allow us to digitize large numbers of materials at high quality and in short periods of time. And our 3D program is moving 3D digitization from resource-intensive activity that focuses on singular objects towards more automated methods that will allow us to 3D capture entire collections. And all of this is possible because of a small but stellar group of individuals who are also the people behind the planning and implementation of this conference. Over the last 2 years, I've seen most of the DPO team through a lens that looks something like this, but in real life, they look more like this. And it's these images that truly convey their sense of humor and their enthusiasm for their work. Special recognition has to go to Jessica Warner, our Senior Program Manager for Policy and Analysis, who about a year out from these conferences starts this process and then handles the mind-boggling number of details that it takes to bring it about. And this year, she was ably assisted by this juggling act by Katura Keel and Nathan Anderson. My thanks go to all of them. And now it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Dr. Zeynep Tufekci. Dr. Tufekci's many roles and titles are a testament to the innovative and interdisciplinary work that she does. Among these titles is Associate Professor in the School of Library and Information Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Principal Researcher at the University's Center for Information Technology and Public Life, and Faculty Associate at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And this year, she's also a visiting professor at the Columbia School of Journalism. On top of all of this, she's a contributing writer at The Atlantic and the New York Times, where she writes about the social effects of technology and the impact and responses to the COVID pandemic. Originally from Turkey, Dr. Tufekci was a computer programmer who turned her focus to the impact of technology on social change. In 2017, she wrote a book entitled Twitter and Tear Gas, The Power and Fragility of Network Protest, which was cited by the Washington Post that year as one of the 50 most notable books in nonfiction. In her work, Dr. Tufekci discusses the complicated role of the internet and social networks in organizing cultural movements. Her findings are the direct result of field research she conducted, observing the Zapatista uprising in Mexico in the late 1990s, the Tahrir Square protests in Cairo, and the international Occupy movements in 2011, as well as the Gezi Park protests in Turkey in 2013. In a 2020 New York Times profile on Dr. Tufekci, professionals from all walks of life talked about her keen ability to hone in on data that eludes others, and her spot-on predictions about social networks, the positive and negative role they play in fueling and maintaining social movements, and the role that digital data collected from voters during political campaigns played in fueling social divisions that continue to this day. Of late, she's become a prominent voice in the discussion of the pandemic, particularly the role ventilation plays in COVID transmission, as well as the data behind masking, vaccinations, boosters, and more. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tufekci.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. I am thrilled to be addressing this conference with one of my favorite institutions that I suspect is true for many of you in the audience today. And it's an interesting topic to be talking about, during a pandemic where we found ourselves quite rapidly moving many things to the digital world to be able to keep connecting. So it's been just a fascinating time period to think about and reflect upon all the ways in which digital technologies have encompassed so much of our lives and what we do with them. So as the introduction has noted, I've been thinking about these technologies for a long time. It's partly because I grew up in Turkey, that's where I'm originally from, under a very limited information regime. There was just a television station. It was controlled at the time, at first by the military regime. We had a coup, because we have many of those in Turkey, and there was just so little information, and there was one TV channel, and it would come on, and that's all you had, and then it would turn off sometime at midnight or 1 a.m. And that was it. It was kind of the sort of short period of time in which there was TV, and there was a single FM radio station, and you listened to whatever music that the DJs thought were appropriate, not necessarily what was popular in the general public or any of that. It was just whatever they thought, which was interesting, right? So you had the sort of very top-down model of information technology and information diffusion, a very broadcast one-to-many model. So shortly after that, though, like most of the world, my home country and many places around the world had this enormous leap to the world of internet and digital technologies, where there were an incredible number of channels, incredible number of ways of talking to people, everything from this large broadcast model where you could, as I am doing right now, just speak to many people at once, to all the one-to-one and peer-to-peer and all these sort of conversations you could have. And all of a sudden, we went from having too little entertainment, too little information channels, too broad, too narrow a way of connecting with one another, to one that is really, the problem is there's too much. There's so much that you have to pick and choose, and sometimes have it be chosen for you in different ways. And that's the part I want to talk about, is this sort of this transition, this historic transition, and the role that institutions, not just the Smithsonian, but a wide variety of institutions can play to try to make this transition healthier and better for society. So I want to talk for about 30 minutes of my allotted time, so that we have time for question and answer and conversation, because I think that those are often the most fruitful and productive ways of using these technologies, is to be able to interact. So I will just sort of outline a few of the big questions I'm talking about, and then we will move to the Q&A session. And I believe there are ways for you to submit those questions. So with that said, what is the transition from controlled and too little information, if anything, to too much information? And what does that, what kind of issues does that create? And what is the challenges, most importantly, of this particular period? One way I like to sort of explain the transition is to talk about role of exercise and food in modern society, in 21st century society. So in my own office, I have a treadmill desk. I sort of get on it and I kind of walk while I'm reading stuff or thinking about stuff, and I can even type. It's a slow thing. And I often wonder when I'm on it how weird it would have seemed to be forcing myself to actually move and walk when I don't have to, if the scene was revealed to any ancestor of mine from a couple hundred years ago, where manual labor was the norm for most of human society, right? Unless you were royalty or, very sort of small circle of people who were excluded from such manual labor. Most of humanity, we did manual labor for to have a living, and plus we walked, right? We walked places. We walked from place to place just because we didn't have cars, we didn't have trains, we didn't have subways, and if we had to go far places, we had some methods. You had ships, you had stagecoaches, but still, so most of your life you didn't have this question of how can I add a walk to my day? How can I add some more movement to my day? But then with 20th century and with the sort of advent of the kind of automation technology that automated so much of manual labor and like essentially replaced human muscle as the key role with which we produced things, the question turned around and it was all of a sudden, how do I put put more walk into my life? How do I? So we started doing things like voluntarily exercising, even hiring people to exercise with us as personal trainers and going to exercise places. I'm just trying to sort of highlight, this wasn't that far ago that this would have seen as an absurd thing. Similarly with food, for most of human history, the question has been one of hunger and not having enough to eat. And 21st century, the last few years, is the first time in human history where instead of hunger, malnutrition that is coupled with obesity is the biggest food challenge facing children under 5. That's a Rubicon. That's like for most of human history, the question wasn't, how do I not consume too much of what's available? It was like hunger. How do you find more? So when you switch supply models like that for food, for exercise, and also for information, the real question becomes, so what's the curation method? What's the way in which we take in from something that has until then had been scarce in many ways, but is essential, and now we have too much? So to come back to our digital connectivity and all the digital tools and all the digital channels, I'm known as a critic of these technologies because I've been writing for such a long time about how to use them in a healthier way. But that's not because I'm broadly negative about them. In fact, it's the opposite. I'm, as the introduction mentioned, I started my own professional career on the technological side of it. And if anything, I would totally put myself in the excited about technology geek tribe of things. And I use these technologies all the time in my life. It was before the pandemic too. So I'm not somebody who advocates for, let's turn them all off. But it's a question of what is the more thoughtful, what is the more interesting, what is the more healthy way to use them, both individually and at a society level, and how does it differ from the way we're doing it now? So I want to focus on one aspect of it, which I think is a key question, which is what's the incentive structure that shapes how these technologies are used to curate and shape our information flows and interaction. And that has been my biggest critique, and this is why I partly wanted to talk to this conference, because I think institutions outside of the corporate sphere have a very big role potentially to play in this, which is that a lot of our, because of historical reasons that outside the scope of a short talk, we have landed in an ad-supported information sphere. This is true for our social media like Facebook and Twitter. That is true for search on Google, which is a different thing. That is true for TikTok, kind of like short video streams. And when you have an ad-supported system, the incentive of the companies is to keep you on there and learn a lot about you so that you can be targeted with ads. Now, when you have an incentive structure like that to keep somebody on the screen and to keep them kind of looking, this is a so-called engagement, what ends up happening is that we have a lot of normal human traits about what keeps us engaged, and these get supercharged. So to go back to the food analogy, one way I like to think about it is that when you all of a sudden have a glut of available kinds of food, and you have a competitive food industry, and if the competitive food industry's business model is to keep you in the cafeteria that you sort of step into and keep you eating, what you will get served is a lot of ice cream and potato chips for lunch, breakfast, and dinner. Because for all of human history until now, hunger being the dominating mode, it was very sensible, and we have evolved to crave those things. Like, there's nothing weird or unhuman about it. That's what humans do, because if you don't eat fatty, salty food when you find it, you don't know when you're going to find it next. Then you need to be able to sort of want to eat those things to be sort of getting enough calories in you, because for Pleistocene did not have these supermarkets. So you would have a supermarket, you would have a cafeteria that's essentially supercharged to take advantage of a very human desire, an evolved trait, an understandable thing, and you just kind of eat that and that and that, especially, because it would be tempting very naturally. Now, convert that to the attention and information and connection sphere. I think it's kind of underestimated usually in sort of general, I think, conversations, but there's a very sort of solid finding from any kind of health and wellness research you can do. But you don't really need the research. You just need to think about the kind of species we are. Social connection to others in our group is the most sort of central aspect of how we live. There's a reason that isolation is the most severe form of punishment and often considered torture by international conventions if it is prolonged. It just ranks right below the death penalty in terms of its severity, because human connection is an essential need. If you look at any kind of longevity and health research, people who are connected to others, connected to their communities, are healthier, feel better, are happier. It's just a central thing. And in some sense, that's why we use these technologies to connect with one another. And in many ways, especially with the perspective of an immigrant with far-flung family, and now with the pandemic, with so many of us, this becoming the only way we could connect to so many people, as travel and many other aspects of being able to converse got limited. It plays a crucial role in the way just we live, and that's a very positive thing, I think. And the fact that it's a screen does not make it less real or does not make it fake. The issue there, though, is if you're doing this connectivity on a platform where you merge human connectivity with one another and entertainment, where it is turbocharged to try to select exactly the kind of thing that would keep you there, it ends up appealing naturally to things that connect us and that capture us and that engage us. And for humans, those things tend to be, for example, what sociologists call in-group, out-group processes, which is essentially us versus them, the tribalization, the kind of like polarization into groups. Now, again, I don't say this to mean us versus them is always some unhealthy, alien, inhuman thing. Quite the opposite. The sort of connecting, bonding with your own group is the bedrock of human existence. We do that. We do that as families. We do that as countries. We do that as nations. But it comes with this other side, which is the outgroup, which is like when you have a feeling of us, you also have a feeling of them. And in many ways, most of human civilization, what we call civilization, is to keep that process from hopefully descending into war and conflict. And we know how terrible that can be, especially in March 2022. That barely needs explaining. But that's human history, is that sort of managing and trying to subsume that us versus them process from becoming damaging and negative. Now, if you are trying to keep people engaged, though, there's nothing more powerful than things like that. And that's why a lot of things that are done online in places where engagement is how you make money, the design in total, it's not just sort of what the algorithms amplify, the whole design appeals to that, and we go into that, we step into that, and we kind of use it that way. So it's a part technology, part human trait process. It's similar for, it's a similar issue for many things we do that try to capture our attention. You can sort of think about it from the television era, where the evening news would highlight crime and scary things and anger generating things, partly because that's what we are attuned to. There's one of my favorite experiments is this how do you remember faces experiment, in which people would just put lots of people, kind of like a stadium setting. You're looking at lots of faces and try to see which one people noticed and remembered, depending on the expression. And people remember angry faces because it's, again, very natural. If you're a group species and you live with other people, if somebody's angry with you, that's a very important to take notice. You want to understand this. You want to take note of it. That signifies danger. So we react to things that create anger in us. It's kind of like, again, it's like the potato chips and ice cream appetite kind of thing of sociality. It's something that we are attuned to sort of try to understand and pay attention to. And on top of all of this, there is the question of like, these are human traits, and the algorithmic and other kinds of design elements can support these. On top of this, for all of human history, we have had political movements and leaders that use these, us versus them, the anger, the kind of trying to divide people and find internal or external enemies to hide corruption, to continue corruption. We've always had these. So now these same political movements can operate in this digital sphere. That makes it much easier for them to do just that. It's not the first time in history. This is not outside of history. This is not something like, oh, everything was great before these technologies came along, but it's a technology system, ecosystem that really makes it easier for such movements to flourish, both from bottom up and from top down by people who do this on purpose. And this is how they reach people and mobilize them for in ways that are not healthy for our society, for our world. And again, it ranges from just conflict and polarization to war, which is the most terrible manifestation of it. Now, so the alternative to this, though, of course, isn't what I would call a fake peace, where we suppress dissent. The alternative to polarization is not a world in which there's no polarization because there's just dominance and oppression, and that's totalitarianism, authoritarianism, repressive regimes. So pointing out like this kind of supercharged polarization is not healthy, is not calling for a process in which, you know, we don't have any kind of sort of conflict within society, because conflict is also what makes progress possible. If there are bad ideas, if there are wrong things, if there's repression, it's that conflict, those social movements and change and all those things that end up with moving things in the direction they should be. So if you told people, let's not have any conflict, any polarization, that's not going to lead to a healthy outcome either. So what do we say then? What is sort of the balance to this? What is the way in which you can have this flourishing of so much ways of connecting in information, but not end up either nostalgic for an era there where conflict that was necessary was glossed over, like say the civil rights movement and continuing efforts to this day for equity and justice. I think that's where you sort of step back and say three things. The first one is, ideally, and this is not something we have made much progress, though, again, it's been something I've been writing and thinking about for so long. It's quite unfortunate. I think that every passing year, it just kind of entrenches more, is that we would design our online interaction so that it did not it did not revolve around a model of engagement where the structures try to keep us around it, right? Like so that's just not going to lead to healthy outcomes. So that would be the ideal sort of step number one. Step number two, which is like not before, after, these are sort of parallel things I think about, is obviously just a new era of media and digital literacy. And I think I'm an educator, so that I joke how well that fits my business model, sort of engaging the public and the critical thinking and the understanding of both, you know, how these technologies operate, what the engagement model brings about, how to kind of be careful about it. It's kind of like putting that treadmill desk in your office, or having a walking group of people, or designing cities that are walkable so people just get to walk just part of their life. So you create an environment in which people understand that the way we live, you know, just commuting and sitting in desks is not healthy, and you create opportunities for people to have more movement in their day, both as a personal choice, but also part of the structure, because you need, and if you're going to have people walking, you need sidewalks, you need parks, you need this infrastructure and the awareness. So that's, I think, an important component, but I think by itself, just telling people you need to walk more or move more, it's healthier, does not really work, because, you know, if you have a long commute and you have a desk job and the day is 24 hours and you have to sleep, there's not time and opportunity. Just by sort of just educating people isn't necessarily sufficient by itself, though I think it's an important part of understanding the situation that we find ourselves in. And I think the third one is the other institutions that are not part of the engagement model the same way. And they are, of course, similarly, they want to keep people interested in what they're doing, which is important, because I don't think the model can be, you just wag your finger at people and say, don't do things that are interesting and appealing to you in the moment, but have a way in which where we try to appeal to longer term interests of people. So to go back to our food analogy, to have both on offer better food and a cafeteria that does serve you better food and doesn't just sort of try to keep you there by producing whatever's most appealing in the moment, but happens to be junk food, but also tries to produce a balance, an interesting, appealing, delicious balance, so that people do have a chance to learn from and connect with and, you know, talk with and be exposed to information and connection that pulls us and incentivizes us in a direction that's healthier, that we agree is healthier, that we consciously think of as healthier, rather than just making choices in the moment. Because making choices in the moment, it's sometimes portrayed as, you know, that's what people chose. But what people choose is a broad thing. What you choose in a moment versus what you would have chosen if you had time to reflect, versus what you thought you should choose and just got tempted, versus what choices were available, are all these broad things that just sort of belie the idea that, you know, people are just choosing something. There's not a single way to choose things. There's the reflective way to choose. And for that to happen, you of course need more things on offer. You need to have those alternatives. And so I'll give you one example. One of the things that I know that is quite successful with a lot of kids is that accessible history. Accessible history videos can be quite popular, just like accessible science videos and accessible videos about, you know, big questions. Children like those things, and they're naturally curious, and all of that is great. And if they're given homework, they're going to go and they're going to be on. To be honest, they're going to go to YouTube and they're going to type this, whatever they're looking at. And one of the sort of, when I was once writing about the YouTube algorithm and what it finds, I heard from so many parents whose children would go to YouTube for research. and they were, going to write a report on, say, moon landing. And, the kid would just go start typing. And at first they'd be at the NASA channel, and they'd be here and there. And then, 45 minutes later, the kid would come back saying, "Mom, the moon landing never happened. It's all fake. I just found out." Because they encountered those sites that weaponize and exploit this natural curiosity by saying, "You know what? There's something really interesting going on there, and they're sometimes really well made too." And this is the environment we're competing in, right? This is the environment where the recommendation algorithm would pull this, because it's just so much more interesting. If there's this big elaborate conspiracy, now you get to learn about. And if you're a kid, figuring out all the things adults keep from you is, of course, very attractive as a proposition. So to compete in such an environment, now again, as I said, ideally we wouldn't be in an environment with such recommendation algorithms, because I don't think that leads to healthy behavior. And ideally, we would also educate children as early as possible on exactly what's out there. They already get that education implicitly because they're there and they learn, and they're, kids are smart. They figure these things out, but they can't figure everything out by themselves, especially when they're younger. They need supervision and adult guidance on exactly how this thing operates, so they themselves can understand what's going on. And I think in the third leg of this is that we produce, and we go there. We go to where this kind of content is, and we also produce our own channels where the kind of things that so interest children and young people and adults are available and done and invested in. Because if everything interested is produced by people who are just like, a lot of the conspiracy sites, they're just making money from the ads. Like, it's that crude behavior. They don't really care about the moon landing or not. It's a great way to get clicks and ads. But if we produce content that is fascinating because it is, but with the kind of production values and understanding, then you have a better chance of the other two legs, I think, working, which, the education and changing the incentives where our information ecology works. But that requires investment. That requires an understanding of these other institutions. And that's why I think of like museums and libraries and historical societies and all those things. I don't think they're like hobby things. They are essential, incredibly essential in a world in which we are competing with all sorts of channels of information engagement that combined together do not make for a healthy society, and that are produced and designed in ways that are beyond the earlier era, where there was a lot of people like me, what I call the chattering classes now. I didn't used to be one of them, but now I am one of them. There was a world in which people like me were able to be gatekeepers to what people got to see on TV, on news, on schools. That world is gone. That world is not coming back. I'm not even sure I personally would want that world to come back as is. There was so much that was left out and marginalized and not included in that world. But just because that world was not perfect doesn't mean what we're doing right now is good. In fact, you find the different new kinds of marginalization and other power structures being reproduced in this new world. And that's what I really like to think about. Like, this is a big transition. It's not necessarily just something terrible or bad or negative intrinsically, but like any big human societal transition, it's very challenging. And if we're going to rise to this moment, we have to think deeply about it. We have to invest in it. We have to think about the infrastructure. And if we don't, and I think we've been underperforming, to say the least, we'll keep seeing terrible manifestations of the tensions generated in this world and things being used in ways that are not healthy. And right now, like, just to give one example, one public sphere that's very controlled and very sort of entertainment-y through lies oriented has been in Russia. It's very controlled and it's very sort of top down in some ways, but it's also very engaging and entertaining. It's not like some boring, dry TV. It's like the TV that's produced there, or like the online content, is very sort of meant to be engaging, and they do, unfortunately, a good job, but it's full of lies. And the consequences of such environments are not good for society or for people. And it's increasingly difficult for even ordinary people to figure out, well, who can I trust? Who's telling the truth? What can I do? Because there's so much coming at it. And I think that's the challenge of 21st century, is to create a world where we do our best and do more and do faster to turn this transition into a healthier transition, rather than the one we're going through, where I think we're way behind in what hopefully we should have been doing. And every year that passes, things become more difficult because the problems add up, creating this feedback cycle. So I'm going to turn to questions if we are ready for that, and then we can go from there.
Okay. We do have quite a few questions. Thank you. That was incredibly provocative and informative. And a lot of the questions I think you'll see are the same. So let me start with the first one is, should we abandon the big corporate platforms?
So if I had a magic wand, I would make them not be like this at a minimum. But abandoning is, like, personally, you could. Like, I wouldn't blame anybody for getting off Facebook or Twitter or TikTok. I don't think, like, at a personal level, they operate in a healthy way in many ways. But as a society, as long as they exist and they form a major part of society, you don't kind of get to step away from it and completely insulate yourself from its effects. And also, I have a very global perspective on this. In a lot of places, these are big part of civil society. Like in a lot of places, this is the only place where you can have certain kinds of dissent. And for example, in where I was in North Carolina, it was where you found most of the relevant information. Like, schools would put pandemic information there, and the neighborhood groups were there, and everybody was kind of there. So I could step back, but if only I step back without alternatives, and not only does it not solve the problem, it creates the issue of, like, where do you access this kind of information? And in places where there's no good alternatives, where this is the only sort of open space compared to the government control spaces, it creates further marginalization. So I think the correct answer would be to make them operate in a better way, because individually stepping back does not solve the societal problem. But that said, as I said, that individually stepping back can be a very good decision if you're in a position where you don't need to be on it, or where you can kind of do what you need to do, or you don't live in a country where this is the only way where you access, dissident information. There are lots of places like that. Mm-hmm. So I think in the US and a lot of European places, you could more easily step back. But if you're saying Indonesia or Philippines or places where, it's essentially, this is the internet for people, and there's ways where you can't reach people any other way. So it doesn't solve the broad challenge. And that's why I think, also there's it's not a competitive space because of the network effects, which means that if everybody's on one platform, say like Facebook, that makes that platform more useful to everybody else. You don't really have an alternative easily emerge. It's kind of like declining to use the telephone, where that's the only game in town, kind of. So I think that makes it a challenge. That's why I think just don't use it is not an appropriate societal answer, although personally I monitor and I try to be careful about how and why I use these things. And there are some platforms I choose to use as little as possible because I don't think they're healthy, but I still end up using them for limited things because often I have no alternative.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up kind of on that is, This one questioner asks, I appreciate your point about the significance of conflict for progress, yet some of our educators are told to avoid divisive concepts. What can they do?
So this is really difficult, right? Because there's divisive content and there's divisive content. And the role of the educator, like as an educator myself, is to find the productive ones and to manage the process. And it is not easy. It really is not easy to highlight and find and have, especially young people, work their way through through disagreement and conflict and conflicting values. And I think like trying to shield young people from that kind of conflict of both ideas and ideals is not good, because it's there. Like if it's there, it's going to be in their mind, it's going to be talked about. And my preference is that we should be in those spaces, in that mindset, talking with them, and not always pretending we have the answers, or the older generation is, right there and we're great and we solved everything, which is far, far from true. So yeah, I think like polarization has almost gotten a bad rap in some ways, like in the unhealthy kind of polarization where you don't have a means to try to make progress. That's clearly not something you want as a society. But you could call civil rights movement a form of polarization, and that was a good thing because it needed to be polarized around. Like opposing things that are wrong can also lead to polarization. The question is like, can you tie that to channels for positive social progress, or is it just sort of swirling around while you get, sent ads and just swirling and sinking the society? And because that's also possible, because there's no rule that says every kind of polarization and conflict is good, right? So that's really, I think, a big challenge, is to sort of be nuanced about that complexity.
Okay, thank you. What recommendations would you have on how we can stimulate productive conversations, especially around race and climate change?
Yeah, so these are like very difficult conversations, obviously. I'll start with the second one. I think climate change. So the thing is, the kids, the young people, they're thinking about it. They're of course thinking about it, right? They're aware of it. They're wondering about it. And very often, like when it comes up, I start by acknowledging what a failure it has been and where things are. And I don't have an answer on what the exact next best step would be, because once again, don't have that magic wand. If I did, I would like have all these options, but we don't have it. So it is a way of acknowledging the problem, the gravity of it, and the fact that it's far, far, far from, finished, or like even barely. I don't even think progress is the right word. We're just slowed down how bad things are by a smidgen, and that's clearly not going to be enough. So there, I think you just have to be open and honest about that and leave it there. Of course, the question of race is another one that is difficult to tackle in the classroom. Kids are naturally into stereotypes and grouping, because that's what like young brains do. They create labels, they think of in groups. It's like a part of how you figure the world out, and you try to make it so that it's a healthier process, that they don't fall into unhealthy ones, and they don't like take that natural tendency to try to understand people and groups and things like that, and then put it in boxes that are unhealthy, unproductive, hateful, incorrect, all those things. And once again, that requires, I think, being in that conversational space with them, because they're going to have that conversation with or without us. So if we can try to be there with them to try to guide this conversation, I think it's a much healthier process. But it is really difficult to kind of, as an educator, because you got these, minds, and there's just sort of all this thing around them. And I think we should be more tolerant of the effort to have these conversations in the classroom, and just acknowledge that like it can't be a perfect thing where every teacher every time says just the right thing. And, as there'll be awkward moments, there'll be things that sound wrong, there'll be things that are difficult. So I think that fear of, oh, I'll just say the wrong thing and then, you know, people will think I'm a terrible and horrible person. I think that's actually made the conversations more difficult and less productive, because then people stick to narrow scripts that feel safe, but that don't engage young people in the conversational spaces that they want to be engaging in. So it's a thorny problem. And as a person, I would advocate for both encouraging such conversations, but also have more tolerance to the fact that they're going to be messy. There's just no, you know, simple way to have these topics come up in classrooms around the world and not have a wide variety of outcomes and instances, some of which may make us cringe and wish they didn't happen. But it's just, you know, hard to avoid when you have a process like this.
Thank you. A couple of questions that have to do with the ad incentive culture of these networks. Since there aren't any alternatives, how do we should we hold them accountable? How do we counteract them?
I'm very, very much for regulating them. I've been trying to beat that drum to not much effect for more than a decade now. I think we should have regulated them from the get-go. I don't think we should have ever allowed this business model as is to get to this point. And I think we should just do what we can even now, turn it back, because there are ways, I think, for these platforms to keep making money and remain profitable that aren't completely on this sort of ad-based model. And we should force them into it by regulating how profitable it can be to do this, because then they will find alternative ways. I mean, because clearly, you know, if you forget the pandemic, we're going to use, you know, these things are entertaining. These things are where we connect to people, where we get information. So we can use them under all sorts of different business models. And they're not going to do it on their own, because it's just making so much money this way, and it's easy, and this is what they're settled into. So this is where regulation, I think, would have played a key role. It's like emissions, it's emissions in cars. If you don't regulate them, car makers aren't going to put those filters, and they're not going to make the cars, you know, less able to accelerate, because as an individual, people will be like, ooh, this accelerates very well. But if you have a society of people using cars without proper filters, then nobody has clean air. That's exactly when you need regulation to protect the public good. The clean air, by making each car perhaps not accelerate as fast as the manufacturers and sometimes even the drivers would like, in exchange for being able to breathe the air we live in.
Are there tools offered by social media platforms that you find most helpful to curate our own information feeds, to cull the fat and salt from our information diet, so to speak?
Right. So I use every such tool I can find personally. For example, on Twitter, which I do use, it is a good source of information. You can use either just let it give you algorithmically chosen stuff, or you can curate your own lists, which are chronological. Now, chronological is like a little klutzy, because it just shows you everything in time, but so can be a lot if you don't have time for it. And the algorithmic one is a time saver. It'll show you what's popular and what's already getting engagement. But what I find is that when I use the popular one, it's always like dunking on people and pointless arguments and like one good point out of 100 like unhealthy things, things that are conflict but not substantive proper disagreement. Right. So what I do is I just take the time and I make like small lists of people that I find interesting and not always in agreement, or sometimes in disagreement. And I would pay for an algorithm that said, here's some people you would disagree with, but that make substantive points rather than just sort of foot fights. So I do what I can. Same with when I do use Facebook. I'm kind of limited in what I do. I don't just sort of scroll like that endless thing. I know it's not healthy. It's like I avoid that. I check what I want to check. I look at a few things. I make groups, lists, things like that. But it's a lot of effort, right? It's a lot of effort, and I'm somebody who studies these things, so I have the time to just explore all this stuff because, I mean, it's part of my work. So I can spend an hour curating this list or that list. And so that's why I think, like, as an individual, I would advise people to try to do that if you're going to use it to get the most out of it. But at a society level, telling people to constantly fight something that is trying to lead you astray, it's not going to really work, because who has the time and the effort and the thing, and it still constantly is trying to pull you in the other direction. So yes, use whatever tools you can. Time, limit your time. Just try to be aware if you're just sort of scrolling because you're bored and you're just scrolling, and then you have this urge to, I'm going to jump into this argument, and you're like, you know what, that argument, is this a substantive argument, or is it just like food fight? And it's so often just a food fight, and I try to stay away from that. But it's a losing battle broadly, even for me, with all my time and the fact that this is part of my work.
What is the role of museums, archives, and libraries in the effort to collect and preserve and make available and curate and contextualize information in this landscape?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because it's just like my like museums and libraries and such institutions have such a crucial role to play, because they're exact opposite of what the social media platforms try to do, which is like just keep you there for the sake of keeping you there and serve you ads. And a good museum is doing their best to try to inform you in the process. Like, they're not trying to keep you coming back, every day to serve you some ads. But of course, the difficulty there is that it takes a lot of resources and effort and investment to try to compete in such a landscape where there's so many actors who are playing the food fight game, and an easier thing that creates, engagement. So I think it's crucial. This kind of curation is the most, like, when you have too much information and stuff you could do, curation is the most valuable thing, right? It's kind of like having that good, healthy, delicious menu when you have too much food is the most important thing. Curation, and that's what museums do. That's what libraries do. They curate stuff. They don't like impose it. They sort of say, here's a good bunch of choices, and there are interesting things, and here's you can find it. So I find them very important. And, digital technologies can play a major role. I use, sort of digital parts of libraries all the time. So I think that's like an example of how these technologies can be quite useful when institutions can create exhibitions and things that are also virtual, in the sense that they're just available, you click and you can kind of go through it. I still think the in-person experience has a lot of things going for it, clearly, not just because of the embodiment, but because you do it as a group with people, and there's a different dimension to being in a physical space with people. But you can't always do that, and when you can't do that, being able to sort of access these collections and things, I think it's great. I just really am a great fan of it. And I think like museums and other kind of information curation institutions are underappreciated as the kind of crucial channel they are, exactly because of the 21st century landscape. I mean, all the sort of information available online hasn't made them less important. In my view, it's made them more important. But they, again, have to not be boring, because you are competing in an environment where engagement is very valuable, and there's lots of money and effort being put into competing with that. So museums have to kind of catch that. I see a lot of good examples, but I think we need a lot more, because it's a big world.
You brought up an interesting and important thing for museums and libraries and archives, which is the resource issue. It takes a lot of investment to work in this space. As a result of that, a lot of us have been collaborating with some of the big technology partners who develop these platforms. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. It's obviously a delicate dance.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The thing is, I have no problem with these big institutions collaborating with these companies, in the sense that that's where the resources are and that's where the technology is. but it has to be done under our terms. Right? It's the way I try to use Twitter, Facebook, whatever, for my own sort of benefit without getting sucked into the sort of the natural mode of the thing. So keeping our independence and keeping sort of this view of what makes things healthier for society is very crucial. So in there, you don't like, I mean, yeah, it's a delicate dance. You don't want to be completely dependent on such institutions for funding, for example, because if you are, then there's a way in which we've seen this in human history. Funding, it's like the ad-driven business, right? How you make money and resources will eventually influence how you think about things. So ideally, it is not the only thing. But again, we don't live in the ideal world. So I understand, like, this is yours are the companies with a lot of money. So the better things are, you can talk about, say, the businessman, say, Andrew Carnegie, but you can also appreciate how useful it is to have all the libraries, right? But the libraries were independent. They didn't just get created and then became sort of mouthpieces for the business practices or any of that. And that kind of like, as much as possible, a relationship that isn't tying not just like legally, but also emotionally and incentive-wise, making these institutions lose their independence would not be healthy, because this is what we got. Like, we've already got so much money in, Washington and other places and all these things. So it starts corrupting the way we think. And I mean, in the end, I have to say, it's not even good for the companies, because they're in over their heads. This is something I've been saying. I mean, the Facebooks and Twitters of the world, they started as these little social networks. And then, you're getting, you're part of investigations on ethnic cleansing. I don't think this is what people thought they'd find themselves worrying about, when they were starting any of this. So this is like having a healthier landscape is crucial, not just like for everybody, I think for these companies. And another example is the pandemic, right? You can kind of say, oh, well, this world works for me, I'm making so much money. But if vaccine misinformation is so rampant and the pandemic doesn't end because, we can't even convince people to get vaccinated when it's so widely available, there's a point in which, this is what I keep saying, if the world is sinking, you're on the Titanic and you're saying, I have a first class ticket. Well, maybe, and it's true. First class passengers on Titanic were more likely to be saved, but a lot of them died too. Like, being on the Titanic is not a good thing, even if you do have the more privileged tickets. So I think that there should be an incentive to try to create a landscape where this unhealthy setup we have becomes less dominant over time, both by the companies themselves, hopefully transforming through both regulation and self-regulation, and alternative institutions becoming more powerful as balancers.
Are there any advocacy groups around regulations that we might know about to help counter?
I mean, I think there's a bunch of organizations, to be honest, but, it has to come from the political side. Right? You cannot just have NGOs and because one, in that space, you'll be outfunded. And if the politicians are just thinking about working with these companies and not regulating them and using them for their own benefit, it's a very short-term thinking. It's kind of like the climate change thing. There's a lot of short-term thinking. That's not good for anybody. I mean, even if you're a CEO at a sort of fossil fuel company, you have grandchildren too, maybe, and they're going to live in this world, right? So I think it's generally bad overall, and the change has to come from the politicians, which means we, the public, have to find people who will lead this kind of regulatory effort and hold them accountable. Because, I mean, part of the problem is the politics is broken and captured by money and high resources, and every people elect people and nothing happens, and then people turn off from the process, and then even less happens. So you have to kind of turn that around and say, all right, politics is broken. It's not working in many ways. It's captured by a lot of the money sources, but still it's the one tool we have to change things, right? You can't just sort of have NGOs and white papers. I mean, I can write them. I'm an academic. I can produce a lot of them. But at some point, there has to be a political process that's accountable, democratic, and legitimate that brings about this kind of change from the regulatory side, while we also pressure the companies, I think, as individuals and as civil society.
Can you weigh in on the NFT trend, especially in the museum sphere?
I'm not going to say anything that I don't really have, it's not my area of sort of particular expertise, because the art space, I mean, in some sense, innovative things are interesting. And I know a lot of artists are interested in things that bring them funding. And that's kind of, I'm always kind of for more experimentation there. The part I worry about is that if it turns into, rather than sort of an interesting art experiment, it turns into a high scam space where there's a couple of sort of winners and then everybody pays attention to them. And then it just becomes a speculative market where people are, part of a Beanie Baby kind of mode rather than sort of creative art space. So that's kind of always the balance, but I don't like dismissing new things just because they're new, right? I'm not an expert in sort of the use of NFTs in the art space. I have been following it. I am learning more about it. And you could have genuinely interesting things happen along with a lot of sort of, scams and other things and Ponzi schemes and just speculative things. So what I would like is for people in the space to try to have these conversations about what's healthy and what's unhealthy, rather than a complete dismissal of like anything that's new and different. Because I mean, the whole art world lives by pushing boundaries and experimenting with new formats and new things and new ways of doing things. So I'm always kind of like, I'm not going to dismiss something just because it's new, but I already see a lot of sort of scams and opportunism and a very top-heavy situation, few people making a lot of money. So that also makes me think, okay, this is not good. So there should be people to try to guide the innovation so that it is interesting and exciting rather than, Beanie Babies and scams.
And this is going to be, unfortunately, our last question because we're running close to time. And it's a general one about what publications, newsletters, or other fora are intriguing to you and that you can keep up with.
Oh, this is such a difficult thing. You shouldn't ask me that. I'm an academic. I read everything. I mean, honestly, I don't really do a good job of curating things because I have a high tolerance for whatever format information comes in. So I'm really bad at, that kind of curation. The one thing I will say is that while there's a lot of new things about all of this, this is not the first such big transition. I mean, just sort of reading about the printing press era is fascinating and informative, right? Just sort of the role of printing press and how it helped transform human societies. There's a lot of great books about that sort of, or just looking at sort of mass broadcast mediums, radio and television, and how they help transform things. So what I encourage people to sort of try to think deeply about the space very often is history does, it's the Mark Twain saying, right? History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. There are very interesting human dynamics that are not completely novel in any way, right? We've been in similar transitions before. Of course, the specifics of the technology matters, specifics of the transition matters, but once you read them, there's this really interesting pang of recognition of, oh, like all of a sudden there was too much information and they were publishing pamphlets and there was a curate. So you have these things. I think history, rather than the current newsletters, can bring you broad perspective that you don't always get in trying to keep up in the day-to-day. So I'm a great fan of good history and good history books. And that's another thing that I always talk about, like a good history book, it takes 10 years. It's a very difficult process, you know, the archives, the work. And history, now for the academic audience, has become one of the hardest academic markets because we keep cutting funding for positions in there. And I'm kind of like, they are producing perhaps some of the most valuable work. It's kind of like museum work. Like, it's very difficult work, the archive work. It requires high levels of expertise, and you learn, like, you know, 3 archaic languages, and you spend 5 years in an archive someplace, but you produce essential knowledge. And these are things that, you know, you can do as a hobby only to a degree. These are full-time things. So not only do I advocate for like archives and history and the role of museums in that space too, obviously, as holders of archives and things like that, I think it's actually a very good investment for understanding that we're not taking full advantage of. You know, in my ideal world, I would really have people sort of read through some of the couple of centuries of how we transitioned with the printing press, and then, you know, telegraph and TV, radio, to try to get this perspective on, you know, how do we do these things, and what were the challenges, and how do we think about it? And that's kind of my, rather than newsletters, that would be my big, I guess, pitch for where to turn.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tufekci. This was wonderful. From start to end, the ending was wonderful to keep us going forward and not to forget our past. So thank you. We are going to cut to a 15-minute break. I want to thank all of you who participated with your insightful questions, and please stay tuned. We have quite an afternoon, sessions on augmented reality in museums, AI in museums, reparative cataloging in museums, and more. So please do stay tuned, come back in 15 minutes. Thank you.